Hello, how are you? Hope you're feeling good. Today I'll talk on my presentation about Lesson 2 in Unit 3. I hope you'll take it. And if you have any questions, please don't be shy. I'll answer your questions privately on WhatsApp with all pleasure. This is Mrs. Rasad from Science Team at New Generation Language School. Today, inshallah, we're going to talk about Lesson 2 in Unit 3, Adaptation and the Diversity of Living Organisms. So the change in the diversity in the environments where the living organisms live was the reason lead to the diversity in the living organisms to cope with the environmental changes such as first climate, food, availability of water. For examples, number one, camel's limbs, and number two, horse limbs. First, we will start with camel's limbs. Camel path ends in a thick flat one to enable the camel wandering through the hot desert and sand. Number two, and about the horse, hoof ends in a strong solid end to help the horse go through the rocky soil. Perfect. A structure of camel bed and the horse's hoof coops the way of movement and the environment conditions in which they live, and this is known as adaptation. So what is the meaning of adaptation? It's the modification of living organisms behavior or its body structure or even the biological functions of its organs to become more adapted to the environmental conditions where it lives in. Perfect. What about the types of adaptation? We have three types of adaptations. Number one, structural adaptation, functional adaptation, and behavioral adaptation. First, structural adaptation. It's the modification in the structure of one body external organs of a living organisms to cope with the environmental conditions. For examples, the camel's bed structure and the horse's hoof structure. Number two, the functional adaptation is the modification in some tissues and organs of the body of living organisms to become able to do a specific function, such as secreting poison in snakes, secreting sweat in humans in case of high temperature. And finally, behavioral adaptation is the modification in behavior of living organisms at specific times of the day or night. Example, activity of bird during daylight and bats at night. Bird migration at certain times of the year. Brilliant. Give reason. Secreting sweat in human in case of high temperatures considered a functional adaptation. Give reason because it represents a modification in a specific organ to be able to do a specific function, secreting sweat. Number two, birds migration is a behavioral adaptation because it represents a modification in the behavior of birds at a certain time in order to survive. Perfect. Now we are going to talk about the reasons of adaptations for animals and for plants. First, for animals, the most important reasons for adaptation in animals are to move in different environments. Number two, to get food from the surrounding environment. And finally, to escape from the enemies in dangerous situations. And about the plants, most of plants are adapted to the different environmental conditions. Now we will study first adaptation and motion diversity in mammals. Second, adaptation in nature of food in birds and in insectivorous plants. And finally, adaptation and the environment as hibernation, estivation, bird migration, and camouflage. But now it's your turn. What is the meaning of adaptation? You have 10 seconds. Brilliant, Miles. You're amazing. First, we'll start with adaptation and motion in mammals. Mammals live in various environments, so they move in different ways, such as walking, flying, swimming, climbing, and diving. Although the limbs of all these mammals are structured with similar bones, so modification have happens to these limbs. Give reason to watch with the way of environment and animals' lifestyle to match with the dominant environmental conditions. Perfect. The following table shows the modification in some mammals' front limbs to move in a different way that match with their environment. So we'll start with the dolphins, the whales, dolphins, and sea lions. The front limbs are modified to become paddles to perform the function of swimming and diving in water. And about bats, the front limbs are modified into wings to perform the function of flying. About horse, the front limbs are modified into legs to perform the function of running. And about monkey and gorillas, the long arms are due to elongated of the bones of the front limbs and fingers to perform the function of climbing trees and catching things. In the type of adaptation here, structural adaptation. Perfect. Okay, now we are going to talk about the adaptation and the nature of food. First, we will start with adaptation and food diversity in birds, and number two, adaptation in insectivorous plants. So, start with adaptation and food diversity in plant. The following table shows the location of plants, peaks, and legs, which are adapted to food the type, the way of movement, and the environmental conditions. So first, we will start with birds feed on meat, such as hawks and vulture, strong and sharp croc's beaks to enable them to tear the prey's flesh, and four fingers ending in strong and sharp claws, three incisors, three front fingers, and one back, been able to control to catch the prey. And number two, insectivorous. Beaks long and thin to pick worms. And about legs, long, thin, and long, thin to eat in water. And about the water animals, such as ducks, beaks wide and blue and hollow to filter food, legs, palm legs to swim. Perfect. Second, adaptation in insectivorous plants. They are self-feeding green plants that their roots can't absorb the nitrogenous substances from the soil needed to make proteins. The following table shows examples of insectivorous plants. Dionia, Drosera, Halophila. Some parts of leaves of insectivorous plants are modified to capture the insects, then absorb the nitrogenous substance that the plant's bodies need. So, This type of adaptation is structural adaptation. Third, adaptation and environment. Some forms of adaptation in living organisms with the environmental changes. Number one, hibernation. Number two, estivation. Number three, bird migration. And finally, camouflage. Hibernation. It is the behavior through which some animals try to dorms and stop most of their vital activities to avoid the low temperature in water. And the following table shows hibernation in some animals as a form of adaptation. So first, some reptiles and some insects, heading some animals as reptiles and some insects and pairs during winter. And about the frogs and amphibians, bury themselves in mud, stop feeding, and their activities decrease in winter. Both of them to overcome the decrease in temperature. But in the spring, when the environmental conditions become favorable, these organisms return back to their normal activities. So this type of adaptation is behavioral adaptation. And what about the estivation? It is a behavior through which some animals try to or stop most of their vital activities to avoid the extreme rise in temperature in summer and shortage of water and rains. And the following table shows estivation in some animals as a form of adaptation. So first we'll start with jorboa, desert snails, and finally some insects. In summer, some living organisms become dormant and hide in humid pairs to overcome extreme rise in temperature, to overcome shortage of water and rain, especially in desert areas. So this type of adaptation is behavioral adaptation. What happens when a desert animal doesn't make estivation in summer? It will die because it can't tolerate the extreme rise in temperature and the shortage of water and rains. Perfect. And now it's time for bird migration. It is inherited behavior in some in some species of birds, where they migrate from cold and polar regions to more lighted and warmer regions for reproduction. Some species of birds are adapted to environmental conditions by migration, so they migrate to some places at the same time every year. And the following table shows the migration in some birds as a form of adaptation. So it's time for quillbird. In winter, some species of birds, as quillbird, migrate from cold and polar regions to search for more lighted and warmer regions for reproduction. But in spring, when the climate conditions become favorable, these birds return back to their original habits. So this type of environment is of adaptation is behavioral adaptation. What happens when quillbird don't migrate when from cold places in winter to warmer ones? They are unable to make production process and may die. Camouflage. It is the ability of some living organisms to be hidden from their enemies or to capture the prey in the predators or predatory species. Examples: leaf insects, stick insects, chameleon. So first, we'll start with leaf insects. It is hardly to be discovered by its enemies because it looks like the plant the plant leave exactly in its color and shape of wings. So this is a structural adaptation. And about the stick insects, it's hardly to be discovered by its enemies because it looks like a branch of plants as well, so it's a structural adaptation. What about chameleon? Its color, it colors itself with dominant color of the environment to be hidden from its prey of insects to capture them and feed on them. So this is functional adaptation. What happens when chameleon goes from areas to sand area? It changes uh, from from green to blue. Notes: camel is considered one of the most adapted animals to live in the desert. It's example of all kind of adaptation, structural, functional, and behavioral that help it live in the hard conditions of a desert. And now it's your turn. Give the reason. Heron and hippo have long thin beak and long legs. Number two, some plants hunt insects. Number three, hawks have sharp claws and strong claws. Number four, camel have a flat, thick back. And you have 10 seconds. Brilliant, you're amazing. Thank you so much. And now, dear friends, I think it's time for playing. And thank you so much for listening and watching, and see you later. Goodbye.